Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, or good night. Either way, this is a panel for a weekend with good friends, and the specific title of the panel is Non-Lovecraftian Horror Inspiration from Folklore to Outer Space. My name is Stephen Wall. I'm the folklore PhD who writes essays about TTRPGs, specifically horror, on delapormedia.com. I'll be your moderator, and I have some creative folks with me today who are ready to get talking. Let me introduce them to you one by one here. Let's see. We'll start with Graham Gentz, just going in alphabetical order. So Graham Gentz is a facilitator and game designer living in New Jersey. Graham wrote Under the Autumn Strangely, a pastoral horror game of anachronistic Americana in a land that never was, and recently released a couple of one-pagers. This includes Ooze Your Daddy, which 100% of the sale profits for that one-pager are going to First Collective 614 for, I believe it's for unhoused folks. And he's also written Immortal Lich Henry Kissinger. Yikes. Well, ain't that the truth? Let's see. We have as well Richard Ruane, or Ruane, my apologies. And he can be found at R. Rook Studio on Blue Sky, Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. Busy guy. And he started R. Rook Studio in 2020 and is the creator of Moonlight on Rosevale Beach, and currently has Haunting of Cliff Cove available for crowdfunding on Kickstarter. And then we have Bear Winters, creative director of TAPM Systems, lead designer, writer, and artist on Project Biomotus and the upcoming Shores of Sheol. Bear's the only one who's brave enough to tell us he's been playing TTRPGs for 30 years and currently lives in Austin, Texas. He's a lover of transhumanism, technology, and space. Well, you're in Alex Jones country. That's dangerous to be. And he also moonlights as an illustrator for other TTRPGs and is an overall nerd tech by day, he says here. All right. Well, fellas, we've had an opportunity to chat a little bit ahead of time. And I'm going to kind of start us off with an icebreaker question. And we're going to just, we'll do a little round robin here. We can actually do it in reverse. We'll start with Bear. But when we were speaking previously, we were talking about film quite a bit. And I'd like each of you to identify a favorite, not your absolute favorite, but just a favorite non-Lovecraftian horror film. Explain how it stands apart from Lovecraft, and what inspiration you might take from it in creating a TTRPG scenario or character or what have you.
Non-Lovecraftian, because Lovecraftian horror is like one of my favorite movie genres, so it's very difficult. However, I'm going to say the original Alien movie. Because it's not Lovecraft, it's not cosmic horror, it's very much a sort of nature horror. But it taps into a lot of what I like about the unknowns of space and the kind of crazy things that nature can do when given the opportunity and the time. And I really like, and this is Alien as opposed to Aliens. Because it's just this horrible creeping in the dark. The survival techniques that you learn as a human over countless generations don't work on this thing. You know, the whole like if it bleeds we can kill it is kind of functional, but it's also if it bleeds it can kill you. With the aliens, which I think was a nice twist on it, and then also like the idea of parasites as well. It taps into so many different horrific things about nature that actually could be seen in nature as we see it today, just in one very goopy Geiger package. And I also really love like biotech as an aesthetic. So I'm very motivated by that. So that's mine.
Yeah.
Alien.
Very good. No, that definitely takes me back to. I mean, you mentioned kind of Alone in the Dark there, and how that kind of taps into something. Yeah, I mean, it even taps into fears going back to like the child's bedroom sort of fears of being alone in the dark and completely vulnerable to the monsters under your bed. Good stuff. Why don't we? Let's see, Richard. Do you have a non-Lovecraftian horror film for us that you want to break the ice with?
So from the monsters under the bed to the monsters in the state house, my non-Lovecraftian horror film that I'm starting with is Cannibal Man by Elo de la Iglesia. I have been on a huge giallo kick lately, and there was a move in Spain in the dying days of the Francoist Spain to sort of try to capture some of the giallo market, and one of the directors who sort of became prominent during that move was a gay socialist named Elo de Iglesia, who cast another closeted gay person in Spain's film industry, Vicente Parra, to star in the film. It is very much about a poor worker who accidentally kills someone and is terrified of reporting that. Something that I think would make sense in almost any country that sort of lives in sort of a police state, but is even more, the fear is even deeper in Francoist Spain, and that starts leading him to kill people he's close to who threaten to possibly turn him in or expose him or encourage him to go forward. And he becomes sort of a serial killer solely out of his own deep and entirely justified fear of the Francoist state. So
Actually, might return to that concept later on here. I think I'll put a pin in that and save it. But I have some thoughts. Let's see. Graham, can you give us an icebreaker non-Lovecraftian horror movie you enjoy? Talk to us about kind of why it's non-Lovecraftian, and maybe add in some thoughts on how you might take it as inspiration for a game.
Yeah, absolutely. I first want to take a moment to like shout out the other two examples because they're fabulous. Alien, pound for pound, might be my favorite movie of all time, and it's certainly in terms of like horror and sci-fi separately. There's just so much that it does well. You know, Bear calls out the biotech, but the biotech stuff is this like ancient tomb that specifically is contrasted by the sterile kind of like really down to earth alien, the ship of the Nostromo. So the idea of contrasts is all over that. And I think that's a huge part of what makes horror work and how you can use that emotionally at your table. Cannibal Man, another fabulous idea of the everyman, the inside, and then fear, and the fact that you're even on a Gallo kick. I mean, I worry for you, like, 'cause it's such an insane subgenre. It's absolutely like what it's doing to you.
I have no faith in humanity anymore. So yeah,
it's such an aggressively dark, even amongst horror subgenre. You know, like there's a lot of people talk about Grindhouse as this kind of genre, but Grindhouse is really just like an aesthetic, and a lot of it really just is like so small. And Gallo has like it's fat, like turned up to 10. You know, so I have a lot of influences. I love horror movies, and I think about them a lot. So I think I'm going to go with The Love Witch. The Love Witch is a movie that came out a few years ago, and it is mimicking a style of a genre picture. So everything from the quality of the film to the coloration to the costumes, it's virtually indistinguishable from a film made in the 60s. It's feminist horror, and it's about a woman who's a love witch or like a sex witch. So she uses these magic and she kind of negotiates through the patriarchy. And it's also deeply funny. And like Alien, sci-fi and horror, I feel, are like chocolate and peanut butter. They complement each other and they make each other better. That's why they blend so well. And I find that horror and comedy similarly do that as well. Giallo also is like has a really, really dark humor edge to it. And like you look at like Evil Dead and things. So I think a great thing about horror is how well you integrate it into other things. And so my way of taking inspiration, answer that last little bit, is the idea that virtually all role-playing games can have horror because horror functions under the same way of tension, of build and release. When I'm doing like a dungeon crawl or something more traditional, like by intention or otherwise, horror elements sneak in because you want players to be engaged. And so if they're engaged by the immersion of whatever is happening, I find it just that is a tool that I use emotionally in storytelling that I think always works really well to get everybody hooked into what's happening at the table.
Great stuff. Yeah, and The Love Witch is a remarkable film. My partner shared that with me a few years ago, and it definitely pulls you into another time and another place. Except for that one scene with the modern Honda Civic in the park. There's a Honda Civic parked in the back of the park scene that just, yeah.
The Honda Civic is immortal. You can't. It transcends all barriers of space and time.
True, yeah.
I'm a proud Honda Civic daddy. You know, I may have traveled throughout time with it. Who knows?
Well, if I'm permitted to break the ice here myself, I think I'll throw in a favorite of mine, which is The Mask of the Red Death, starring Vincent Price.
Okay.
I see that as a non-Lovecraftian horror film because, Lovecraft said that Poe was a big inspiration to him. So, it would have to be before Lovecraft, and also just the feel of it. I would say the very kind of texture of a lot of those kind of. I want to say it was Harvey Korman that did those films. The kind of those particular Vincent Price Poe films. Just the way there is kind of a softness, sponginess, kind of rubberiness to it that's very much kind of rubber mask horror that isn't Lovecraftian, but still has a way of getting under your skin, even though there is a fakeness to it, and I think that is a remarkable thing. I think that I'm trying to find ways to put that into my games a little bit more, kind of that schlocky B-movie quality, but it's still kind of horrible in its own way. And so with that, I'm gonna let's jump to a kind of a complex question here to warm up to warm up on, now that we've all gotten to know each other a little bit with our favorite films. What are some reasons that you would want to take inspiration from non-Lovecraftian sources? Arguably, we're all here because, listeners to the good friends of Jackson Elias, fans of the Call of Cthulhu role-playing game. We're saturated with Lovecraft. I think it was Bear who said initially that Lovecraftian horror is just an absolute favorite. Was that you, Bear? Okay.
Yeah.
And so why would we even want to take inspiration from non-Lovecraftian sources for our horror?
I've got an answer for you.
Okay, sure. Fire away.
Because it's easier for people to immerse themselves in. Like,
Okay.
Lovecraftian horror by its very nature is out there somewhere. It's the unknowable, it's the unseeable, it's things that should not be. Introducing people to concepts that are, beyond the comprehension of the human mind. I think when you tap away from Lovecraftian horror and you start going into things that are a bit more mundane, it taps into a part of the brain that has already evolved to deal with those threats. They know that fear because it's so genetically, ingrained in us. A fear of the dark, a fear of abandoned places, a fear of, eating the wrong kind of fruit, or it's just something that we over time, like, for instance, the uncanny valley. I love the whole concept of the uncanny valley, like, because it says that somewhere we genetically inherited the need to be afraid of something that appears human but is not quite human. And like, because that is a fear, like, I mean, that could stem from, when humanity was fighting off against like Neanderthal man, but like tapping into those things, I think is a much more immersive process for the player, especially if you're writing it for a player. Like, if you say to them, like, you see something crawling under your skin, that kind of invokes images of things like tapeworms, or parasites, or something like that. Something that's a very real horror situation that, on a genetic level, we tend to stray away from. With Lovecraft, it's very difficult, I think, to say, like, you see a sunless sky filled with eyes, and silhouetting a bleak temple with a multi-tentacled god standing on the top. It's kind of, I think it's much easier for humans to involve themselves in horror that is much more natural than it is cosmic horror. But I think that's also the appeal of cosmic horror, because it's so unthinkable, and it's able to poke at the imagination a bit more. Like, the horror of the imagination and the horror of what we know is two very different things.
All right, and I think we'll actually revisit that topic of kind of the horror that we can know at a later point here. But let's get a couple of other thoughts here. Graham, Richard, what are some reasons you'd want to take inspiration from non-Lovecraftian sources?
Graham, I don't want to cut you off, but
go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I think what the thing that jumps out at me is that Lovecraft is not even sort of the final voice in cosmic horror. He's not the first voice in cosmic horror. We certainly see that in other authors emerging before Lovecraft, but post Lovecraft, we've seen a lot of things that sort of constitute cosmic horror, and I think we even have the revisionist Cthulhu mythos movement that's kind of, I think, best exemplified by Victor Laval's Ballad of Black Tom and the work of Ruane Imris and Kitch Baker, with moving even out of horror into fantasy by kind of taking the dreamlands into such a much warmer, more cheerful place. But I'm coming back to Ruane Imris because still in the horror adjacent mode, or at least horror, in sort of that gothic mode, while telling very Lovecraftian stories from the first person place of the people of Innsmouth, rather than having external people come and see them as monstrous, and then talking about the monstrosity and the horror of that series comes from human abuse of the people of Innsmouth, dragging them off to the desert, subjecting them to experiments so that very few people are left alive at the end. And the power of that series just sort of comes out in the need to continue interacting with humans, because there's just no one, none of their own people are left in the world. And so I think part of the reason that it's really important to look at non-Lovecraftian horror and non-Lovecraftian horror writers is Lovecraft didn't even quite the final thing to say about cosmic horror, or the directions that cosmic horror can go in.
All right.
Which is not a slam on Lovecraft. No writer has that, but
no, fair enough. No, but I mean, definitely, he's not as big and all-encompassing as we might first think. Is a good thought. I mean, that's a meaningful direction to take it. And I mean, definitely I would say that if I can just chime in briefly, one thought that I've always had and one thing that I've enjoyed is that because of the nature of how kind of Lovecraft left his legacy, it belongs to all of us. There is no heir, so it is absolutely all of ours to do with as we wish.
The best thing that happened to Lovecraft is letting those works slip into the public domain, because now you can address all the problems with the author, all the promise of the author, but all the problems with the author by letting other people get in there and do actually in-world critique without having to only kind of confine that to reviews and scholarly work.
Yeah. You can actually stand there and say, buddy, you got it wrong,
Yeah. Best argument for early public domain, or faster moving works in the public domain more quickly. So,
Yeah, I think this reflects a lot of my views, but I'm going to take them further, because why shouldn't we slam Lovecraft? Let's do it a little. Like, I love In Smith Makes the Next Person, but so much of this, like the creeping other, like it's all rooted in like a very overt racism, and the idea of something being unimaginable. Like Bear just described something that I imagined very easily, and a lot of this empty space is promise, but also the idea of non-Lovecraftian horror is so vast that I find that I want to like deconstruct even the idea a little bit. It's like saying, okay, so how do you get into non-Shrek cinema, right? We've all started with Shrek. We understand that Shrek is the beginning and all of all cinema. So how do we even conceive of a movie that's not Shrek? Terry Pratchett has this quote about J.R.R. Tolkien, about how Tolkien in fantasy is like Mount Fuji in Japanese art. Either it's there in the foreground or is absent by conspicuous choice, right? So when you're defining these things, and I just don't think Lovecraft is that to horror. Whenever you're doing high fantasy, you're like, oh God, how am I going to deal with the Tolkien issue? But Lovecraft isn't that. Anything that you can imagine that is or is not horrific isn't necessarily what this Lovecraft is. I think that it's built over time culturally. There was a point in which all of us discovered these stories, and it felt so different from what we had found. And presumably, you either absorbed them or now call Cthulhu in its current form in the way that you have all of these lovingly made images on the internet of somebody in a zoot suit killing a monster with a shotgun. Is what it has become. Call of Cthulhu as an entity has never been bigger. And I remember when I left D&D, and I started in college playing like Vampire the Masquerade and Call of Cthulhu, it felt so different. And I think that's what people they're wanting. So the idea of how we can find horror any other place, oh man, it's infinite, right? We have 4 movies that we brought up and how many more could we come up with just about themes and realism and inspiration? It's as wide as the human experience. And that's why I love horror, because it's always giving me and teaching me something that I want to be thinking about down the line, even after I leave the table.
That's actually a great way to lead into kind of my next question. If anything, Graham, and because I was going to throw this to you at one point, because when we were initially talking, you made the joke of is anything not Lovecraftian horror?
Right.
And so I was going to throw to you the question: where does Lovecraft end? Do you think Lovecraft ends? And you seem to have kind of, at least, it's clearly you were making a joke initially there, because you kind of seem to have come at it from the other side there, in that there is so much that is not Lovecraft that we can get a hold of if we want to produce a non-Lovecraftian TTRPG scenario, character, etc. But I would throw that back to you and also to Bear and Richard as well. Are there some definite kind of places where Lovecraft ends? Some places where there's some spaces in horror that Lovecraft never touched? Let's maybe look at it that way. Are there spaces that Lovecraft never got to? Because clearly he came out of kind of loving the Gothic. He kind of did his own thing, but then he died, and horror moved on after him.
Mhm.
So, yeah, there's a lot of things he probably influenced, but what are some spaces that he never really reached out and touched? I'm from your perspective. I've got my own kind of ideas here that I went over with you. We even kind of brought up some of our favorites that you can bring up certainly now. But I'm curious to hear from all of you. Where are those places that Lovecraft never touched that we can freely swim in non-Lovecraftian waters?
There's layers to that phrase.
True. That's why I chose it.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say I
Sure.
think two areas that I think that Lovecraft never really touched, that we therefore we don't always appreciate when we talk about horror and gaming, because Lovecraft had such a big influence on the way we think about horror and gaming, is the psychological thriller. If he was trying to write psychological thrillers, I'm sorry, but the Gothic romance, and I think it's really important to understand those two have a close relationship with each other. Daphne du Maurier certainly dabbled in both. Shirley Jackson touched on both, and then the real master of the psychological thriller, Pat Highsmith, also a deeply problematic figure that we should critique. I feel like Lovecraft certainly touched on Gothic horror sources and certainly captured the sense of isolation in the Gothic. But specifically those du Maurier style Gothic romances, or that also have their sort of long own history, and the what I think of as the Pat Highsmith style psychological thriller. Are things that Lovecraft are really important parts of our slasher traditions across slasher genres. Both of those have a lot of resonance for the slasher tradition. Coming into Shallow,
just for my edification and maybe the edification of anybody who might be listening in on this, can you connect Gothic romance and slasher? Can you draw the line?
More through that, like as Gothic romance sort of shifts into becoming overlapping with the psychological thriller. I think like V.C. Andrews is one that most people would be aware of, that is both a Gothic romance, but also a psychological thriller, as the isolation and the psychological effects of the isolation sort of creep in on the children. I am not a huge fan of V.C. Andrews, but I know that is one that people connect with. In that sense of isolation, the sense of being alone, that sense of not having a lot of other connections. It comes in less in the American slasher and more in, say, Spanish and Italian slashers.
Okay. Yeah, but now I can see it. Now that you kind of mentioned that the through line is the psychological thriller. The idea, it's almost kind of like it's almost kind of like a simplified version of it. I mean, not that I mean, I'm not a huge fan of slashers, I'll be honest, but I mean, it is almost kind of like, in a way, the slasher is kind of the pop culture approach to the psychological thriller, which is a child of the Gothic romance. Is that kind of what you're?
Well, I think it's a separate tradition that sort of merges together. There's a massive romantic suspense genre that Mary Stewart, and I mean, Daphne du Maurier was probably one of the best ones we know. Mary Stewart and others sort of wrote the Gothic romantic suspense novels, which are very much involve murder, killing, fear of violence, fear of being attacked. And that sort of drifts into several international film traditions. And then in America, it sort of shifts into becoming the slasher. In America, we much more tightly tie psychological thriller to slasher. So, yeah.
I'd even jump in to suggest the idea of Gothic horror and romance. Again, being about isolation, it's very much like Yellow Wallpaper. It's the idea of ghosts and isolation and being stuck in this big house. And that drawing into a kind of Hitchcockian sort of idea of the wrong person accused, and the more psychological of his version, something like Vertigo, where the first and second half are all about isolation and the strangeness, into Psycho, which you have a sort of a very gothic mansion up on a hill, and it's a proto-slasher, but so much of it is about this inner being of these things. So I think that through those lines in all the way back in gothic romance and horror, into the psychological idea of what is it to be in these minds, and then that has a direct line into slashers. I think that there's a lot of places to kind of jump off from that. And Bear's just got this great thinking face on, so I would love to see.
Well, I'm going to give him the last word on this. The only thing
that's a really bad idea.
Well, the only thing, you're the only one who hasn't talked, so by process of elimination. But I will add that I think in some ways Lovecraft did try to copy some of those ideas. If you take, I mean, you were mentioning isolation, and that immediately got me thinking of The Outsider.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was the and I think I'm thinking of the right story here. But yeah, there were efforts. He had early efforts to kind of mimic those ideas, but then when he kind of got into his own thing, definitely I could see that. Yeah, the isolation, the separation. He never really carried that forward into those places that like Psycho and stuff. But he also, he also knew some of the people who were doing things like that. Like he knew Block. And
Right.
I mean, Block is behind Psycho and all of that. So I'm causing trouble here. I'm just muddying the waters a little bit. But Bear, why don't you take us out here as far as this question? Where does Lovecraft end? You know, where can you draw a firm line that says there's no Lovecraft here in this particular scary thing?
So I'm going to preface this with I am neither as well read or as well cultured as my two fellow panelists here. So I've been thinking hard on this one, and for me, I think it's when I look at Lovecraft's writing, it is very cold. It is very isolationist, and it speaks a lot to the fact that he didn't really know how to human very well as a person. And I think there is, and this may tie into like romantic horror. But I think there is a lot of horror that can come from interpersonal relationships and the loss of those interpersonal relationships and betrayal within those interpersonal relationships. And I just think it's something that he could never really tap into. Because like when you write something horrific or you try to catharsize, you know, a game system out of some experienced horror or into a book, I think you have to have a kind of understanding of how that makes you feel. And Lovecraft spoke very deeply about isolationism, whereas other people can talk very much about, you know, someone they love for 20 years suddenly turns out to be a serial killer or you know, something even worse. And I think that's where you can draw a hard line between Lovecraft's writing and other horror, is that he could never tap into that very personal, very integrated relationship that people can have, and the fear of losing that, or the fear of having that love betrayed, or the fear of being attacked by someone who you trust deeply. I don't think he ever could really tap into that, and that's where I think that hard line is for me.
Yeah, he's not David Lynch, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, what you were talking about there, Bear, two thoughts came to me immediately. David Lynch, and I recently read Robert Aikman's The Fetch for the first time. And that really kind of, because this is like basically a man who's kind of haunted all through his life. And kind of, 20-year relationships that suddenly turn because of an experience and things like that. This was, I mean, he was having Lovecraft was having his own emotional journeys with like his marriage that didn't work out, with his aunts, with his mother, that sort of thing. But no, he never really put that on paper for anyone to look at other than in letters.
Yeah.
So,
and I think that talks a lot to how people experience things and how that affects their writing. And I as the genre has panned out, we've already talked, Lovecraft is not the owner of cosmic horror. We know that. But you can't argue that his writings were very influential on the genre as a whole. And I think as people kind of spun off from that same feeling of isolationist impersonality, and in fact that might even be the definitional way that Lovecraftian horror differentiates itself from everything else is because of that weird isolationist, very horror of the self, and how it affects a personal thing rather than horror of the unit, horror of the tribe. It's the tribes are the one that are the weird ones. The Innsmouthians, the Throgmortons. Those guys,
you don't
the
see from
ones
their
that
point of
band
view.
together. Yeah, no, they're banded together. They're unified. They're the tribes. They're the ones. You're the outsider.
Mm-hmm.
And
Always
that's
the outsider looking in. Yeah.
right. So
Let me change
sorry, I'll
the
stop
subject here.
waffling.
No, that's okay. Believe me, I have some. Don't worry, I have questions in store for you, Bear. I was I was paying attention as you guys were kind of talking there. I was trying to spark conversation before we got started over the last week or so, and I've got a couple of things to grab each of you with here as we go. But let's talk about a subject here that didn't really come up, but I kind of want your take on it because this is kind of my specialty here. Let's talk about folklore. It is actually one of the first things on this panel. From folklore to space. So, where could we turn to in folklore for non-Lovecraftian inspiration? Graham, did you have a thought?
Yeah, sure. No, I was just riffing on the idea of folklore to space. It made me think about taking off. I've recently spoken in reference to the game that I published. I called Pastoral Horror, and a question I had in an interview was, "What does this mean to you?" And I kind of rounded about the idea is that there's all these subgenres that are getting more and more play. And when I was trying to pitch the feeling of my game, I wanted one. I wanted one that I could say, so I made it up, and I said it's pastoral horror. And folk horror, I think, is only getting more beloved as people realize that it has a name and a face, and they're like going to it. Things like The Wicker Man and Midsummer. It has a very universal, beloved kind of texture to it, and people realize, oh yeah, that is creepy. In a way that all of us kind of key into. In the way that Bear very intelligently talked about the other of Lovecraft is all of those people who like each other. Yes, it's overtly racist, but it's also the idea of they have a community, and that's scary and bad. It's this like outdoor way to look at groupthink, but it's really not. It's just about the idea that like I don't like that these groups of people have a unified idea and identity and culture, and that's dangerous. But folk horror speaks into, I think, something outside of that and more complexly in like a really exciting way. There's been this huge uptick in sort of Netflix shows from Eastern Europe where you always have a serial killer in the woods. Somebody always has antlers, and there's usually fetishes hanging from trees. Like this is its own subgenre. And so the idea that folk horror means you have lore. Ooh, everyone loves lore. And you're building on traditions. I mean, you can go any direction. Is it a literal monster? Is it people? Is it both? Is it somewhere in between? I think that there's such flexibility and excitement with that you can inject it with some kind of energy and any kind of thing that's very, very exciting. I think Lovecraftian horror loses its bite when it's known, when it's a known canon, when you understand, oh, this is this kind of god, and this is their name, and this is their cults. And so the moment in which I'm playing that game, it loses all mystery, all excitement for me, when it feels very procedural. We can't all be Mulder and know every single thing, because then it is no longer interesting. There has to be this complication to it. And folk horror gives that to however direction you want to make it, and that's really exciting for that.
Well, I used to tell my students that's the beauty of tradition. It's a lie we tell ourselves that there's continuity. But Richard, Bear, jump in on this. Folklore, places you like to go with folklore that are non-Lovecraftian for inspiration.
Folklore is kind of my weakest topic. In honesty,
let me put it to you a different way, then, Bear. What about what about conspiracy and urban legend? Are those maybe more familiar?
No, and I don't mean it's weak as though I love folklore as a topic.
Oh, okay.
It's just my weakest as far as my inspirations go.
Okay.
Because it doesn't have to make sense. And it doesn't have to it doesn't really have to have continuity within its own canon. You know, like you can have gods that give birth to themselves and then eat their offspring, and and suddenly that's how trees grow. That's there's no. So I'm very much much more of a sort of more natural science kind of horror layer. I like the horror parts kind of almost rooted in something recognizable. With folklore, I love folklore. Like I picked up Vaesen recently, like the RPG Vaesen. Beautiful game. Really want to play it. It looks fantastic. I love that stuff. But as to how folklore, like I would have a really hard time writing it, is what I'm saying. Like I leave that up to other people because they're so much better. Like Graham's really good at this. Like the people that wrote Vaesen is really great. It's just folklore for me has always been very odd. But I will say I watched a show recently called Time Team. It's an old show from like the 80s and 90s. And if any of you are familiar with Blackadder, the show Blackadder, the guy that plays Baldric is the guy that runs the Time Team. He's the one, and it's an archaeology show. And they recently found a burial mound up in the moors in Britain with a cave system underneath. And in the bottom of this cave system, they found skulls from children, multiple children, over a time period of 3,000 years. Like dating from the Bronze Age all the way up through the Roman era. There have been skulls of children placed in this cave for no known real reason, like specifically why it's this cave, for 3,000 years. And stuff like that is great for inspiration. That's not really folklore, that's just history. But it's still, you can come up with a multitude of weird reasons as to why.
It's history by way of folklore.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah, I tend to like to use it as kind of throwing a drape over my natural things, kind of my horrors that might be from space and nature and things like that. Throwing a cloth of folklore over it. Let's hear from Richard here.
So I think my mind automatically goes to folk horror. I think the fascinating thing about folk horror is it frequently is not the monster emerging from the fairy tale. The scary thing about folk horror is that it's frequently the community that forms around a set of beliefs. And frequently, like in the early movies, that was always poor people constructing themselves around like early beliefs. And those are still some freaking great movies. And you see that up through Midsummer. It's still like people are like outskirts, people who are kind of living on the margins of a much more industrialized society, who are kind of forming around these beliefs. But I think one of the areas I'd really love to see that horror kind of grow and expand, that I think is the structure of our kind of folk beliefs in the more industrialized world. You've seen sort of the wealth cult, the cults that kind of form around gathering money and running workplaces and beliefs there. But I think one of the places I always go is definitely that sort of folk horror. The real, like the source of the terror is going to be the people who believe in these things. But you also have kind of a really exciting stuff going on in gaming where we watch horror emerge from the fairy tales into our modern world in ways that we didn't expect and did not completely fathom or understand what those entities were about. In novels, Gemophile's experimental film does some really, really cool stuff around that. I told Graham I was watching the Symphony Entertainment run of through the Under the Autumn Strangely. I will get my prepositions correct. And really they're beautifully blending sort of both ways of sort of integrating folk horror, things coming out of that surreal sense of the fairy tale, but also that one of the things that comes out of that surreal sense of the fairy tale is that super disturbing sort of community that's formed around a powerfully cruel, amoral belief that was ready just to throw people. And it struck me that the source of horror in like that the lottery, probably one of the early, super informative text on folk horror, is also the horror that sort of drives the last few chapters of 1984, is this fear that something big and powerful is going to seize other people and turn your neighbors, friends, and family members sort of against you. That powerful image in the lottery of one of the last things the victim sees is her daughter being handed stones to throw at her. But also that's a real big source of horror in 1984, with the protagonist's neighbor, like, oh no, my children turned me in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we've actually got our first audience question.
Oh, great.
So we've stirred up controversy.
I hope it's about Bear's upcoming game about a god that eats itself and makes trees and worshipped by child killers in caves. Because I'm the backer number one.
Yeah, you better copyright that idea fast, Bear, because I'm already coming off ideas from that.
Oh, my folklore ideas are weak, and then he spits that out. Come on, that rules.
Yeah, that's how trees get made. Yeah,
that idea is open domain now. You guys can have it. I don't mind.
All right, I'm jumping on that one. But we actually, Kristen Jensen Romer is listening in and has asked, surely folklore has rules. The whole folklore motifs reduce it to archetypal tropes, and then following up with, I'm not arguing the archetypal folklore motifs, or that work, or that folklore is anything more than a fetishization on one take on heritage, fossilized in print, but it still has rules as such. And I would. Since we're going to dive into this, and what I would say is that I'm just going to come at this as the guy who did the doctorate on the subject. I would say that that's where folklore studies began, was definitely with kind of trying to determine those rules and everything and those motifs. Mm-hmm. I think what happened over time was an understanding that there was. Because from there, a lot of folklore kind of classes begin with, well, what is folklore? Mm-hmm. And the definition I've ended up with, that I'm comfortable with, is anything that is of or by human beings that doesn't come from a formalized source. So informal culture. And because of that, you can actually kind of squeeze in between all these genres and everything. As long as it's not coming from a government, from a church, from a school, you've got folklore there. And so it does have formalized structures, but it's also very plastic. It can be played with, and it's reconstituted with every generation. So
maybe I can clarify my statement there a little bit about rules.
Okay, sure.
So yes, within the boundaries of the folklore that you make, there are rules. Like, for instance, the Fae have to honor a bargain or something, or entering a circle of stones can transport you to the Feywilds or to somewhere else, or a particular god has to be sated by the blood of a virgin every 2 months. Like, there are rules within that, and I think it is those. Part of the construct of folklore is having something that must be done that is not normal, or folklore horror anyway. Something that is outside of the normal societal contract has to be done to appease something, so existence can continue in your certain way of life. But when it comes to writing folklore or creating folklore as a whole, like as a genre, there seems to be no rules there. So like it's less about within established folklore that's already there, but when you're writing for folklore, or when you're trying to, or when people bring folklore together, it doesn't, the rules seem kind of a bit more malleable at the time of implementation, rather than centuries down the road where people have established rituals around that. That's what I think I was more meaning with a lack of rules, rather than within established folklore.
Fair enough, and I'll also bring up just one kind of accepted definition of a particular kind of folklore here, which is the legend. A legend, in terms of how folklorists categorize it, a legend is a debate about belief. So it's not a matter of a decision that this is the belief. It is the conversation that goes on around the belief. That is the folklore. That is the legend. So because time is a factor here, I want to move on to the other side of the coin here, the other side of the discussion, space. Let's talk a little bit about space. And this is, again, what did Lovecraft not talk about when it comes to space and the nature of the universe and all of that? What were the developments that he missed out on, for example? And I did kind of want to throw this to Bear. I mean, it's your choice if you want to take it first. But I know this was a topic that you were very interested in.
I am very interested.
Yeah.
And
Richard, don't worry, you're next.
Talk about your game, Bear. Bear, talk about your game. Bear, talk about your game.
I'm not going to talk about my game.
Talk about your game, Bear.
I'm writing a game that's based around pockets of reality being shredded by a black hole. And it's kind of a reverse. It's a reverse Eldritch Horror where you are actually the Eldritch Abomination visiting different realities in the orbit of this black hole, and you're there to try and reclaim parts of yourself that you lost when you became a dead god. And reality kind of buckles at your presence. So it's kind of I love the idea of space, and I love the idea of cosmic horror. But I think what Lovecraft really missed out of that is that there is enough horrific things out there in space without there needing to be a god behind it. Like you're talking about celestial bodies billions of times the mass of our sun that generate more energy in death than our solar system will in the entirety of its existence. There are magnetars out there that will literally separate your core atoms from themselves just by being anywhere close to it. Stellar radiation can cook the skin off your body. Traveling at near relativistic speeds means that if you come across even a mote of dust in the vastness of space, then you're probably going to get turned into a very long string of chemical components. It's the insanity of everything that sits outside of our little blue bubble, a little speck in the middle of our solar system, is terrifying enough without having to introduce, like, Yog-Sothoth or, some other Eldritch Horror. Like, it is very isolationist, and I can understand why, cosmic horror was such an inspiration. But, like, there is no planet that we've discovered that can comfortably house us. Like, this is our one home, and the fact that we are cooking it right now means there is no alternative. Like, we could terraform Mars for decades, millennia, and it will still never be the perfect environment that we need as a species to continue. Like, that terrifies me. Like, Interstellar for me is space horror, because, like, the idea of, like, there is a plague and a dust storm that is slowly killing off people on Earth, it is a very real horrific thing that could happen. 2 generations and people start starving and choking to death. And the idea that we would have to go out somewhere, or like, all it would take is some fairly decent sized pebble moving at near relativistic speed to, like, pierce the atmosphere and impact somewhere, and we have a second nuclear winter. The sun decides to burp funny in our direction, and we lose every electronic on the planet. Like, things like that are terrifying, like, horrifically terrifying. You don't need Eldritch Gods for that. But yeah, like a time slippage near massive gravity wells, like that idea that in a couple of hours, like, everybody that you could have known and loved have moved on with their lives by 70 years.
Yeah,
it's things like that are far more scary to me than some tentacle monster from outer space. Like, just in my view of it, anyway.
Okay, Richard, Graham, any further thoughts to add to that?
I think one of the things that's fascinating to me, I think it's not even recent, but starts to take on some Lovecraftian overtones because there's this sense of like the vast amoral force of nature is the interest in mycological horror. Probably one of the best works I've read recently is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia, which is about an English family living in Mexico who has this this weird symbiotic relationship with a powerful amoral mycological entity, for lack of a better way to phrase it.
Yeah.
And I think mycological horror is, I think, coming out of space but still staying in the realm of like the natural world.
It's,
I think
it's nature. It's like it's alien. It's it's that nature has evolved to the point that I mean, it's like the what is it called, the cordyceps, I think that's how you pronounce it, fungus, the zombie fungus that turns ants into zombies. Yeah. Graham?
I mean, I'm gritting my teeth going back to Lovecraft to answer this, but he wanted a mythology, and he was like, I'm going to try and get away from these kind of Abrahamic ideas. I want angels, I want demons, but I don't want anything. So why not space? Well, I'll go with space. And so the idea that Lovecraftian horror is defined by the endlessness of space is something that I really want to push back on. One of my favorite examples of this, or even the idea of a non-human intelligence, or of vastness. Solaris is one of my absolute favorite books, and I love both adaptations. Both the Tartakovsky and the Soderbergh are wonderful, and at its core are my two favorite questions, which is, what does it mean to be human? And therefore, the much larger question, what is a non-human intelligence like? And that cusps kind of Lovecraftian in the idea that you are going for these different things, but it's more than just, the Yith, which are just sort of monsters, and like, oh, they're alien, they're so strange, or the god idea. But Solaris really grapples with this in a really firm way. And the idea of wanting to want things. As characters in narrative and fiction, it's defined by desires and wanting things. So how do you invert that so completely and so vastly? And then how do you tell a story? I'm so glad that you brought up David Lynch earlier, because I think David Lynch gets kind of a bad rap for being JK so random, when there's some really deeply human themes throughout all of it, and then trying to divorce yourself from a kind of linear narrative, which then is so disorienting in a really exciting and scary way. So these are the kinds of themes that I want to pull from. How is this overwhelming sense deeply personal and become human? That's both scary and hard to grapple with, in a way that I find more compelling than in the way that Lovecraft ever dealt with it.
Okay. And Christian Romer is still listening in and just kind of added in that is talking about how the problem is it's horrific, but doesn't remove all player agency. You can't do much about that's okay. So basically, how do we deal with cosmic horror being kind of an end to player agency? I mean, if you're talking about star stuff, where do your players actually stand in that? And I think. And I think, Graham, actually, you kind of you put the nail on the head there, really, with kind of, you take it to the inner world. Maybe that is kind of a direction of, it doesn't become, I'm not fighting a challenge from beyond the stars or anything like that. I'm trying to determine what it is to be human in the face of this, and focusing in that direction. And that actually gets me to something, and this is where I'm going to close the noose around Richard, because he brought this subject up when we were talking, and I'm going to have him start us off here.
No good idea goes unpunished. That's what I'm hearing.
Yes. So, Richard, this one's for you to start us off. And in his life, Lovecraft struggled with personal relationships and connections with other human beings, often leaving them out of writing entirely. What
He
kind
frequently
of
lost the struggle.
What's that?
He frequently lost that struggle. Yeah.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
And what kind of horror can we create when we focus on human relationships?
I think the obvious answer is the psychological thriller type horror, where
Mhm.
we are looking to, which also goes back to the romantic, the romantic side of the Gothic tradition, versus like the ghost story side of the Gothic tradition. But we are looking to form connections, and we risk betrayal, lies, and secrecy. Um, uh, that notion that we are not forming the connections we think we're forming is kind of core
Yeah.
to the psychological thriller, and that we have to find ways to live with that uncertainty. It's also really important to the detective novel, and to crime writing in general, all of which sort of touch on the horror tradition at various points. Uh,
Because it is
but
really horrible to actually share yourself 100%, isn't it?
Yes, well, it's certainly terrifying to share yourself
Yeah,
100%.
terrifying. Fair enough.
You have no certainty over how the other person is going to respond or what they're going to do with that sharing. I think the other component of that, though, and that I think we talked about, that's an important part of the folk horror tradition, is that you live among these people and you think you love them, and then they turn on you. That's not solely that's not how Midsummer specifically plays out. A little bit, but the community there is not known to everybody who encounters it. But I'm thinking of the Blood on Satan's Claw, which is about a satanic cult and that sort of forms and turns on people. But I think there's also that tradition that's older than Stephen King, but I think Stephen King, especially the 70s writing, really exemplifies it, where your tethers to your identity and your in a Call of Cthulhu term, sanity, are not your understanding of the everyday world. It's your connections with everyday life. And the real fear of the horror is those connections are going to be slowly severed, whether through trickery, through violence, through your own mistakes. Not that they're going to cost you some sort of nebulous notion of sanity, but they're going to cost you your actual anchors in the everyday world that connects you to the other people around you.
Yeah, because there's two directions that story can go. It can start with "I am alone, I want connection," or
Right.
it can be "I am not alone, but I don't want to lose my connections."
Yeah.
And you can kind of you can tailor the story both ways. Both ways have something
Yeah.
terrifying.
And those, I think and I'm a big fan of Stephen King. I think some of his best novels for me start with I am not alone, and I don't want to lose these connections, and these connections are so important to me.
Mhm.
It's really important when you look at Carrie as a story of other people who knew Carrie, and watching Carrie separate them from their loved ones out of a very understandable reaction, a violent reaction. It's really important in the Dead Zone. It's really important it's super important, especially in the novel of The Shining. Very different from the movie, but watching both Jack and Danny slowly lose their connection to each other, which starts as a very intimate connection in the novel.
And that is something where, I mean, like games like Call of Cthulhu that have you write in, connections to other people and things like that. It's something that I feel that we don't, because we kind of create scenarios independent of the characters, that we don't get to use those that much. But actually, if we take the time to have a game that we kind of build from the ground up with our players, then we can use those connections that they create, that they write into their character sheets, to dangle the sort of threads in front of them, to manipulate them, to move pieces on the board, essentially.
Right. And I was really appreciating Graham bringing up Solaris, because I remember correctly, and it's been forever since I read the novel, but I feel like one of the powerful things about that protagonist is that he has only recently become isolated and then sort of thrust into this very alien situation, and is sort of mentally struggling to retain those human connections, which sort of then gets exploited or not necessarily exploited, but sort of used as an entryway for alien intelligence to contact him. Because that becomes kind of the source of, if I remember correctly, that's sort of the source of sort of the alien sort of using memories of his spouse.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's the idea of purpose, of trying to make this human connection even without purpose. So it's divorcing a lot of these assumptions that we have about connection and ourselves and with others. And this broader idea, what is a non-human intelligence and what does it truly mean, which is deeply fascinating and also scary. Again, my idea of sci-fi and horror basically being so linkable that because they complement each other in that way. Bear brought up all the ideas of Interstellar. Like, it's an action thriller, but if you really sit down and think about all the things that are happening, they're deeply awful and horrifying. What I like about what has been talked about at the table in terms of how you get these personal connections, you've essentially just described how I run all my role-playing games, which is the ones I write and design, versus when I'm a facilitator, which is that I live by this credo that prep is death. Because if you're over prepping, you're not listening to the players, you're not engaging them as their characters or even the world. And so Under the Atom Strangely is no prep in terms of the game. And so what you do is you create all these elements, and then players are continuing to add to them. So the only thing that exists is what players have come with there at the time, and then build upon it, because it is far too common, in my opinion, in what has been taught in a folk game-esque way, is that you have a GM who is emotionally or informationally separated from everyone else and is doling this on players who are these empty vessels for these things. But then people have to choose how they become engaged, and it becomes so disconnected from the emotional experience that you've missed the whole point entirely. And by that doesn't just make the game better. In my opinion, that is the game. That is the entire game. That if you're not doing that, then we're missing this, and we're just playing a miniatures war game, which is fine. Yeah. It's just needing to have these conversations about the elements is what needs to be happening at the table to even begin playing, in my opinion.
Yeah, going to that non-Lovecraftian horror inspiration space really does help with the kind of the newer generation of games. I call it new from my perspective, because I mean, at 44 it's newer. But these ideas that they're cooperatively built, GM and players are working together using the relationships that between themselves, and then to create it, and then the relationships that they create in game, in the fiction, to build something.
I think one RPG tradition that is not as important to the field as it looks on the surface is the globe-trotting player character group. Mm-hmm. And once you sort of fix your player characters in a much smaller setting, those relationships become way more important because they're going to encounter them again. I've used both the hey, let's create the relationships kind of whole cloth in our group. And sometimes to get started earlier, I'm sometimes like, hey, here's our existing R map of the relationship map of the town. Where do you fit in?
And we're back to David Lynch.
And then even hostile relationships, or even sort of semi-hostile relationships, become an opportunity to rethink what human connection is about. So,
yeah. Bear's got that pensive look, so I'm going to give him the final word on this.
I'm trying really hard to think of good answers, and like I said, you guys are a bit more well-read than I am. I have two examples of psychological horror that I think speak to me the most. The first for me is human indifference. The idea that no matter what I do, or what I say, or who I get to know, I make no impact. Like, no matter how I live, it changes nothing. Nothing I will ever do will ever make the world a better place, or change something for the better, or like that kind of that speaks to me on a very personal level, and that is a huge fear of mine. And the idea of just being ignored, being an outsider, like that whole disassociative horror that comes from experiencing life through as though you're just watching it go by on a TV rather than interacting with it. I think that speaks a lot to the isolationist part of horror, without it being Lovecraftian per se. It's just on a much more personal level. And the second is desperation. I'm going to return back to Interstellar because there is this one part that I think is the most horrific out of all of it, and it is and spoilers for people who haven't seen it. There is this part where they discover Matt Damon's character, Dr.
His
Mann.
name is
And
Man was the best of all of us. It's such a subtle movie.
I know. And it's just like this guy was led to such desperation and loneliness that he was willing to essentially sacrifice the continuity of his species so he could see another human face again. And that to me, just like there is this one line that he says is like, "Pray you never know how good it is to see another human face," and like that is a very haunting word, like a very haunting idea that there are people out there, they're just unreachable, and I'm gonna put myself into this deep trance, and I'm gonna like a deep coma, and hope that someone someday wakes me up. And I hope they never find out that I'm lying to them, that they're in a place of safety for my psychological need. And that concept of it it's horrific and it's desperate, and I think it speaks a lot to the human psyche. Like that film actually talks a lot about the human psyche, about the last things you see when you die. I love it. It's probably one of my favorite films of all time.
Excellent.
If I could go with
on.
Bear's suggestion, and I think Bear has answered every question with a single answer, which is, what is Lovecraftian horror? How do you do it? With what scares the shit out of you personally? Like, really think about that, and then there you have your answer. Like, horror doesn't have to be abstract. Like, if it scares the shit out of you as a person, use that. Like, that's the number one thing. If you're walking away, I'm glad we said it here in the 11th hour, but I think that's the most important thing anybody can get from this.
Well, and I'm just going to add here from our shadow fourth panelist, Christian Jensen Romer, who's watching us on YouTube right now. He says, "You've made me look at HPL in a new way. It's very much intellectual horror about ideas, not emotional horror. Or is that too simplistic?" And I want to say I think there's something to that. I would want to kind of take that away and tinker with it a little bit, but that's definitely that is definitely an option to kind of if we want to create a theoretical model for what we're doing here. I mean, especially now in kind of the back half of this panel, we're definitely talking a lot about kind of emotion and as opposed to ideas. So yeah, I mean, what do you guys think? I mean, is HPL about intellectual horror about ideas, and if we want to step away from him, we get into emotion? Or
so I'm going to say no, because racism isn't intellectual. That's a very instinctual fear that he built a lot of his horror around. But I think where the intellectual part of it is that Lovecraft built a lot of monsters. And he built a lot of imagery to give shape to those very instinctual fears. And I think that's where the intellectual part comes in. But no, I think fear is a very instinctual thing, regardless
sort of
whether it's
intellectualizing fear, maybe.
Yeah, I think that would be a better descriptor of it. Yeah, I think intellectualizing fear into something that could be, scientifically almost explained, or like, oh, I don't understand this, so science can't explain it either. I think that's the intellectualization of fear, rather than it being like an intellectual construct within itself. But yeah, no, otherwise I agree with the concept. Yeah,
I think it's also
go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, Graham, go ahead.
Yeah, you sure?
Graham, you go.
100%.
I think yes, absolutely, it is true. But I don't agree that racism is instinctual. I think that gives a certain unearned power or even naturalism to it, which doesn't exist. And I think absolutely racism is a intellectual exercise, as in it is created, it is taught, There is nothing rooted in it beyond your like general xenophobia. Oh, if you're not from my group, you might bring in a disease. Like that is not at all what racist ideas are built on and then become. And to kind of return it to this idea is, I think, really losing what it becomes and how people pass it down. And I think we have identified what Lovecraft is building, and then how he got it was all very intellectualized. I think that's another great way to say it. The short answer is yes. I think that we've talked about his text being cold. We've talked about the sources for it and why. And then what speaks to all of us in terms of the horror that we like and that we respond to, we keep coming back to these emotional responses that are kind of lacking in these other things. So short answer is yes. I think that is a fine line to draw in the sand, as it were, about what this is and what this isn't.
I'm gonna clarify something a little bit there. When I say that racism is an intellectual, the idea of something being intellectual is something looking at the pros and cons, like being able to rationalize. It's not an intelligent argument to be racist. I like the process of intellectualism or the process of being intellectual on something is always questioning something, always asking why. Is it cultural? Is it taught? Sure. I think that I don't think that racism is instinctual at all. But to say that it is a process of, because I like to think that us all sitting on this panel are fairly intellectual people, and we can all intellectually rationalize that it is not beneficial to anybody to be a dickhead. And so, I think that I'm not very good at maybe using the right terminology there then, but yeah, my I think you know what I'm saying. But like, yeah, I don't think I don't think that it is a show of intelligence.
Certainly not.
I don't think it's intellectually sound by any means, but
no,
I think
and that's what I think I'm going for here.
I think we're searching for an operational definition, and for me, it's not about it being logical. It's about how the idea is constructed. Is it constructed by emotion? Is it constructed by instinct, or with thoughts? And that's how I'm operated on that. And so, for all means, I think that's what we are looking for, is that kind of idea.
We agree. I think I think we're all on the same.
Of course, we agree. It's operational definitions trip everybody up.
Yeah.
Let's go to Richard here, and Richard, I want you to kind of give us the what our shadow fourth panelist has brought up, this idea of this line in the sand between, I guess, what we're calling the intellectualization of ideas versus emotion. If you could give us your thoughts on that, and then we've got 20 minutes left, if I'm not mistaken. So I want to get to two more topics, 10 minutes each. But if you could give us 2 minutes on this idea that we've kind of been looking at.
Among people, on the horror fiction, horror movie side of the internet, there's an ongoing meme about like, oh, it's so scary, it would frighten Lovecraft, and like everything frightened Lovecraft. The idea of people who weren't him frightened Lovecraft. So I think there's definitely like a deeply emotional sort of drive that Lovecraft fiction is sort of trying to rationalize and sort of idealize isolation. Because for Lovecraft, frequently in fiction, the real fear is that you're going to meet somebody else, that you're going to try to seclude yourself. And that's that sort of hermetic, not hermetic in the scientific sense, hermetic in the quasi-religion, the aesthetic sort of like, I'm going to be just an isolated person with my books.
Yeah. But you're building that bubble, and then the idea that another person could come in and burst that bubble.
Yeah, another person who does not have the correct intellectual criteria, or who is sort of your Harley Warren, who's just going to give you bad ideas about contacting entities from beyond the void. Your best friend is going to do all this, lead you in a terrible direction. So I think there's a lot
of theme. Yeah, that turns up a couple places. The best friend does lead you astray. Pickman's model, another example.
Model, definitely. Yeah.
That's getting the message married. Of Lovecraft, don't have friends.
Yeah, don't have friends. Definitely do not get married. Is definitely the thing on the doorstep. Whatever you do, don't get married. you're only going to encounter bad people, and they're going to lead you astray. So I think because of his fear of other people, which came out in racism, it came out in sexism, it came out in so many different ways. That I think a lot of his stuff is the emotion driving that is a romanticizing of isolation in some ways, and anxieties about the world and contacting the world. That's larger than you and that you can't necessarily fathom and that you have to learn to negotiate with and trust.
Perfect. That's just a hair over 2 minutes. We're getting there. We're coming down to the end here. So I've got these are kind of up for grabs at this point, especially with what we're talking here. So let's talk about. I mean, we may have people listening to this down the road who are not fans of horror movies or horror writing, but they all have everyday lives, just like we do. Where can we find some inspiration in our everyday lives for horror?
Mm-hmm.
I'll throw this open to anyone who wants to grab it.
Your job. Like,
Yeah.
if you work
the
a
man
day
wearing
job.
the Wayland Yutani shirt.
Yeah.
Well, this is a Skynet one. Thank you very
Skynet.
much.
My apologies. We were talking Wayland Yutani. Sorry.
But your work is ultimately you have someone else that has power over you. If you work in the glorious US, like I think we all do, your healthcare may be based solely on your employment, and that's a fear. If I lose my job, can I afford my medical bills? There's a lot of horror that you can get from normal everyday trauma that comes with your work. It can also be a place of great satisfaction. Like if you're, I know a lot of really awesome people that are mental health specialists, and it's tough work and it's hard for them, but it's they do one of the hardest jobs in the world, and I think that they're fantastic people for it. So it may not be across the board, but
I have a partner that's a healthcare provider, and it can be. What I'm often told is that the work is fantastic, and that the people that she works with are fantastic, but that the management is the difficulty. And again, we come back to it, and I'm just thinking more and more about those kind of the options to fill in your connections on your character sheet and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. Nobody ever puts in their boss.
No.
I think that's something we may want to start looking at. Nobody, and the other idea of, and also the idea of the PC having a day job. I mean, I think that's a direction you could go. Let's hear from.
I played a role playing game recently. I can't even remember the name of it because it was some forgotten indie thing from about 15 years ago. But it was essentially about like sort of witch magic in like a Renaissance Italy, and so we were asked to kind of freeform create some things, and I broke the mechanics and swapped them, and basically it was about like one of us was like, what happened to this demon? And I was like, no, the demon actually came and like took over our city, and I think the demon is the mayor. And I built all of this story around this idea that we had freely elected a demon, which is now running the city. But instead of then playing, and then we got to choose our characters at the end. So instead of being like, well, clearly I've made this amazing character, I chose to be his chief of staff. And I curved everybody and said, okay, I don't actually want this amazing character to be played. I want to be the like idealistic young sort of staffer who has this really weird boss and is now working on the re-election campaign. So like going around and trying to convince people to, Barkathoth, like, I mean, sure, he's a demon, but like he has some really solid policies that are going to help the city. And I mean, you should see his opponent. And so I gave myself a really difficult boss immediately because it felt like such a potent choice. In terms of real life inspirations, I already talked about exploiting what you personally are afraid of. So I think that's like the first answer. And very potent. And so for me, the opposite side of the coin is like, what are your comforts? What do you love? And then what happens when we don't have them anymore? As a way to take away those.
Contract.
Yeah. So, Bear talked about the idea of healthcare. Okay, what does that look like? Okay, you have isolation. You have these relationships. Something like body snatchers. The idea of take it away if you understand who people are and what those relationships are. So, what am I personally scared of, or even like what are my comforts? What can I live without? What does it then look like if I pull them away? Then you're equally doing an intellectualized experience about this horror, but then having to confront it emotionally. So you can kind of do both. They don't have to be separate by any means.
And Richard, your thoughts?
Gentrification. Gentrification is the longest psychological thriller that's been going on in New York City for decades, because for a long time it was that relationship where you're like, I don't like what you're doing, but you're making this argument that you're at least preserving things, which is theoretically technically true, that you're like, oh, we're at least like, we're not tearing things down, we're not coming in Robert Moses style, we're fulfilling that Jane Jacobs vision of a city that's preserved and keeps its own history, and then suddenly, like, you're in this troubling, problematic relationship, but sometimes it does a good thing, and so you're kind of like, and then it goes full on, just like, no, we're tearing those buildings down, ha ha ha, we've whittled down all the protections you guys put up, and now we're in control, and it's all going to be gone. So I think those kind of community relationships where there's issues, and then those issues sort of manifest and get rid of everything that you use to rationalize sort of that relationship. And I think gentrification is sort of that, is sort of like the one that's most on my mind lately. As you can hear the hammering in my background, is one more building in my neighborhood has been torn down, and they're building some other monstrosity in its place.
I would say, I mean, if I can throw in here as well, just because it hasn't been brought up. I mean, we talked about medical bills, but the actual experience of a health scare. I think, especially as kind of, I mean, we have, you have role players who haven't gone through that, but because you have some of us kind of, I guess, grognards who have experienced things in terms of our medical health, I think that can be an inspiration as well. I think, watching what I'll tell an experience from my own personal life here, if you don't mind. I had a 1 in a million strep throat infection. It got into my legs. It caused purpura.
Oh my God!
Bloody things crawl up my body, and as they crawled up my body toward my chest, toward my heart, it was a real visceral. It was an experience of body horror, a genuine one, and I always return to that whenever I'm having that experience. Anything that's been uncomfortable in your life can be a source of horror inspiration. Any pain, any misfortune, you can turn that around into something you can share in a way. Just going to put that out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like, medical health is an incredibly powerful source of fear.
Yeah.
To share a personal story, I also have a degenerative heart condition, and whenever my heart decides to not beat correctly, there is this feeling of it's like alarm bells go off in your body that tell you that something is horrifically wrong and you don't know what. And it's not adrenaline. It's not. And it becomes adrenaline as you start to panic, but like that initial feeling is just like your heart is not beating in sync. Like, this is dangerous. Like, you are in danger. You need to figure out what's going on, and it's such a weird when something that you take for granted, like your heartbeat. I remember the first time it happened for me, it was paralyzing, because you don't understand. Like, your heartbeat is such a consistent thing across your entire life, and then when it stops and it doesn't function correctly, that fundamental part of something that you've known your entire life changes you, and you become afraid of that happening again. And it's just small things like that, absolute terror.
It changes your relationship.
What's your intimate medical issue, Richard? Let's all go around the bar. What do you got? What do you got for us?
Yeah.
The horror of dental insurance in the United States. If we think health insurance is
teeth stuff. Oh, people hate teeth stuff.
Oh,
That's something that gets X-carded a lot for me at tables. People are like, no teeth violence.
Dental insurance could get X-carded a whole lot more.
Oh,
yep.
When a health insurance provider tells you your maximum out-of-pocket expense, they mean how much you're going to pay. When a dental insurance provider tells you your maximum out-of-pocket expense, that means how much they're going to pay. Like after we pass $2,000, it's all on you.
Yeah. Luxury bones.
Yeah. You don't really need those teeth.
Yeah, it just takes me right to cult, right to the inferno, right to the torture demons, and all that good stuff. Let's move on to one last thing I want to bring up, and actually, I'm gonna just spin this right around on Richard again. I'm gonna get you twice because you brought
bring
up
teeth again, Richard. Work teeth in.
Yeah,
the gentrification of your teeth somehow.
Yeah, gentrification of dental insurance. That's what we're looking for. And the teeth. Just the whole,
The teeth.
There we go. Just something.
Okay, that's your game. We have Bears game.
Matthew
We're gonna have
Bartlett
pitches. Everyone's gonna have a pitch by the end of this.
Oh right, yeah.
Sorry, I was just gonna recommend Matthew Bartlett does some great stuff involving a dentist's office. That's really good. But anyway, I'm going to turn this back around on you, Richard, because you brought up a film that you liked at first about from the perspective of a worker, I believe, in Franco's regime.
Yeah.
And so let's talk about kind of an afterthought here. Lovecraft is very specific on the perspectives he chooses in his horror. I mean, I think we've talked about that quite a bit and kind of how, intellectualized those perspectives are. Where else can we, or what are some non-Lovecraftian perspectives that we can use to inspire us? Let's end on that. 10 minutes, and then we're going to say our goodbyes. So, Richard, start us off.
I think I'll just grab this. That I think the perspective of marginalized people. I think from my perspective, I frequently start thinking about horror from the perspective of the queer person, and the challenged relationship with their community. I think one reason I'm so focused on keeping people in the same space in a lot of my own game writing is because you don't really find a lot of queer experience if you keep just moving around. If you and your party keep moving around, you might have a one-night stand here or there, you might go to a gay bar, but you don't really encounter marginalized communities at all until you actually situate yourself in a space.
And you don't encounter being stuck with that community.
Yeah, and you're
having
really
to endure their ups and downs.
You have to, yeah, exactly. And you also just don't get anything more than a perfunctory sense of a city. It's a lot like being on a 2-day tour of like the major cities of Europe. You don't really actually get a meaningful sense of what those cities are or what they're about and what their whole existence is like until you spend some time in that. Until you spend some time in that space. I think that's why I'm sort of like, hey, let's have a game that's just in one town.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that kind of Americana feel. Graham, Bear, thoughts on other non-Lovecraftian perspectives? Where can you seat perspectives that are perspective in a role-playing game that is non-Lovecraftian?
Yeah, I think that Richard's on the right path here in terms of establishing community, relationships and ideas. So much of this perspective that Lovecraft kept returning to is the idea of the oppressor being treated like the oppressed. It's the idea that like the other is the scary thing, even though it's completely the other way around, right? This is a definition of privilege that just like you can't get away from. And so if you take that and shine a light under it and then set it aside, you all of a sudden have all of these other options and ideas about how you can break down and like what truly is horrific, and then what are these experiences being shared. The idea of like being the Innsmouth people and being like, who are these gentrifiers coming in to our creepy little seaside town. How dare they? These are all things that you really get to pull from in a very authentic way, instead of it being this assumed, this constructed idea of this is our society. These are my assumptions about society. Therefore, this is what is horrific to that imagined rule of society, even though it's all completely fictitious. So trying to find the sources, again, that are personal to you means that nobody else in the world is going to have this particular view of society beyond Lovecraft. So trying to adapt yourself to him, it should be the other way around, where it's about you and about what your experiences are, and then taking that forward. Nobody can have your lived experience, and that is truly vital, no matter what your brain chemistry may try and tell you. Maybe that's the story in and of itself. So trying to take those ideas mean that you have, like I said up top, a infinite number of stories and things that are about you and what is personal to you, and therefore people get to react to that, because then you are, by the nature of horror, you are flying in the face of what these real life things are. The isolation, this disconnection with humanity. This is the reason why we're all here, being like, we all love horror, and we get to talk about it, and therefore we kind of have to, we could get to do both. We get to talk about these universal experiences and be happier and more comforted as people, while still experiencing or talking about what these things are emotionally. Like, I think that's very powerful, and it's why I keep returning to this fiction in general.
Bear, last word on non-Lovecraftian perspectives in horror role-playing.
Yeah. I don't feel qualified enough to talk to perspectives of, say, marginalized people. I would rather give them the platform to talk about themselves, because I'm very fortunate in that I am not really from a marginalized community. What I can talk to, though, is grief, and
Okay.
I think listen to the people that you know are grieving, divorcees, people who have lost loved ones, people who have had to move a lot over the course of their life, because just changing anything foundational to who you are as a person is a form of grief, and grief can really saturate a lot of different aspects of people's perceptions. And I think that in itself is a kind of weird isolationist horror, because it's grief often makes you question a reality in a sense that seems very human. Like, was this person that I knew ever really like that, or were they lying to me? You know, this person that I lost has, you know, there's no footprint of them left. Did they ever really exist? You know, there's a lot of horror that goes with loss, and that changing of a foundation, and I think that can be really cathartic for people to put into a game, and or to write about, or to kind of use that as a demonstrative tool to show others how you feel when you are in that pit. And the great thing about is when you write games based on the perspective of grief, and you see other people enjoying that game, and building characters, as a writer and a designer, it's massive for me. So hopefully it'll be the same for you guys. But yeah, I think yeah, definitely grief is talk to those people. They need you to talk to them. They won't feel like it at the time, but like, if you know anybody who's going through a divorce or a breakup, or they've lost someone, get their perspective. Ask them how they feel. You know, don't industrialize their viewpoint. You know, you know, do it out of compassion, but it will give you a good outlook as to how your perception of reality changes, for sure.
Yeah, I think it was transformative for me, my kind of interest in horror, when my father died. So I can definitely I can follow what you're saying there. That is kind of a somber note to end on, but I think very meaningful. So I think I'll further add an epilogue of everybody needs to see Interstellar. I think that's the clear
absolutely
nailed it.
The other side of this panel, or the end of this panel, I think the last thing is that we all need to go see Interstellar. Okay.
Yes.
With that, I will invite you all to say your goodbyes and offer one more plug. Once again, my name is Stephen Wall. I'm a folklorist who runs a small blog of essays called delapormedia.com. Hopefully more things in the future, but that's where it's starting right now. And let's start with let's go in reverse order here. Let's start with Bear, if you want to.
Oh, thank God.
Plug your.
Yeah. I really don't want you to end on me. That'd be terrible. My name is Bear Winters. My currently published game is Project Biomodus. It is a transhumanism, post-apocalyptic, survival action horror. It's a whole bunch of genres, but it's and I'm working on a game called Shores of Sheol, which I talked a little bit about earlier. You can find me on most social media as Bear Winters. But I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to speak to you. I'm super happy for being here. Thank you for having me. That's it. That's all I got.
Great. Richard?
Hey, I'm Richard Ruane. I run our Rook Studio, and I'm running my game Moonlight on Roosevelt Beach here, which was published at the end of 2022. And I've got a Kickstarter going right now for The Haunting of Cliff Cove, which is a small town game about the Scooby Gang finding themselves in a Dario Argento series of movies. So,
and people can find it. Did you give your socials? Okay.
Our Rook Studio, one word, no dashes or anything, on Blue Sky, Twitter, Instagram, and Threads. So,
all right. And Graham, take us home.
Hi, everybody. I hope you enjoyed us plugging all of Christopher Nolan's films. My name is Graham Gentz. I wrote Under the Autumn Strangely, which is a pastoral horror game of anachronistic Americana in a land that never was. You can find it and various other things, such as Ooze, My Daddy, and Immortal Lich, Henry Kissinger, on my itch, which is grahamgentz.itch.io. And if you want a physical copy of Under the Autumn Strangely, you can, because it's on Indie Press Revolution. So go check out IPR and all these other lovely games written by my two fellow panelists.
Right, great. Thank you, everybody, for taking part. Thank you for the audience questions. And thank you to you in the future who are going to observe this. Take care.